Hey guys, welcome back to another video. This is Troy with Cichlid Bros. In today's video, we are talking about an awesome Lake Tanganyika cichlid, the Julidochromis species, and we're going to give a full care guide and breeding guide on the Julidochromis species. I cannot wait to talk about them. Let's dive right in. So first off, the Julidochromis species come from Lake Tanganyika, not Lake Malawi like some of the other African cichlids you may know, but Lake Tanganyika, which has a much more diverse group of cichlids that you can find there, which include the Julidochromis species. And there are multiple Julias that you can pick from. You have the Julidochromis Ornatus, which is the type that I actually have right now in my 40-gallon breeder. I have a small group in there that I really love. They have some yellowish coloration coming in their bodies with that horizontal black stripe. There is also the Julidochromis Transcriptus, also known as the masked cichlid, which has kind of vertical stripes along its body and is more white and black. There is the Julidochromis Regani, the Mark Smithy, the Marlieri, and the Dickfeldi, which are all awesome Julidochromis species. You could call them Julies for short. And as you can see, they are a very unique fish with an elongated body and more of a torpedo shape than a lot of other fish. They are a great option for both beginners and advanced hobbyists because they don't require a massive tank. They get awesome color and behaviors and personality, and overall they're just an awesome fish to keep. So first off, they are endemic to Lake Tanganyika in East Africa, and their natural water parameters are high in pH and harder water. So if you naturally have those water parameters, they are probably going to thrive for you. So like me, I have pH around 8.2 and I have hard water. It is perfect for Tanganyikan cichlids, and kind of the reason I'm starting to keep more and more of them is that I know that they're going to do so well in my water parameters. And they are tropical fish, so they need temperature ranges anywhere from 75 degrees to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and they should do really well in your tank. And although they aren't the hardiest cichlids you will find, they aren't too difficult to keep. If you have big swings in ammonia or an uncycled tank, of course you're going to have issues, but for the most part they aren't too difficult. Just keep up with your water changes and your filter cleaning and maintenance and keeping those nitrates below 40 parts per million, no nitrite and no ammonia, and you should have no issues whatsoever when it comes to water parameters. And the Julidochromis species don't get very big, so you don't need a massive tank like I mentioned earlier, and they only max out about 3 to 3.5 inches. The Julidochromis ornatus will probably be the smaller end of that, about 3 inches. The females of all the species get slightly bigger than the males, but both the males and the females get the really cool patterns and color to them, which is definitely a plus of the Julidochromis. They can live well over 5 years, up to about 7 to 8 years if you keep them in the right environment. And when it comes to the tank size, this is something that is pretty awesome about the Julidochromis. You could get just a couple of them or a very small group and put them in a 20-gallon tank, and they will probably do just fine. You might even get some breeding action going. If you keep them in like a 30 or a 40-gallon breeder, you can get even more of them. You can maybe even start expanding into tankmate options, which we'll talk about in a second. But because they don't get very large and they aren't very aggressive, sometimes they can get a little feisty to each other if they're kind of establishing a pecking order, or if you have just really tiny live bears or tetras or something like that, which probably aren't recommended. But for the most part, they are not that aggressive. They're on the peaceful end when it comes to cichlids, which is another great thing. So you could absolutely keep them in a species-specific tank like I currently have in my 40-gallon breeder. I might expand into more Lake Tanganyika community type setup in the future, but for now, I just want to see this colony grow and start breeding, and I think it's going to be really rewarding. But if you are looking into tankmate options for the Julidochromis, there are a lot of great options from Lake Tanganyika, including the shell dwellers, the world's smallest cichlids. You can get pretty much any of the different shell dweller species, and as long as you put some shells in the tank, they have places to go, whereas the Julidochromis are much more rock dwellers, which we'll talk a lot more about here in a second. You could also do other rock dwellers like your Leolupi, your Compressiceps or Calvis, and those are great options even though they're slow growers. They look kind of like prehistoric, but they're very unique Lake Tanganyikan fish. As long as you're not trying to breed the Julidochromis, you could start adding in things like that and you'll have a really cool community. I would recommend like a 40-gallon breeder or larger if you're starting to add some of these fish. One of my favorite options is the Cichlids because they utilize the mid to upper levels of the tank, and they're very active and colorful with the purplish blue bodies and the yellow tails, It's a great combination if you have them in the mid to upper levels. You have the Julidochromis, Leolupi, or the Calvis or Compressiceps kind of around the rocks or midsection to lower section, and then maybe even shell dwellers kind of on the substrate in their shells. It's a really cool community type setup, and you could probably do some of these in smaller numbers in like a 40-gallon breeder, but if you have a 55-gallon, which is a little taller, or even like a 75-gallon, you have a lot of extra space for things like the Cichlids, which I think would be an absolutely awesome combination. I would go so far, in fact, to say it's one of my favorite trios to keep when it comes to cichlids is the shell dweller, the Julidochromis, and the Cichlids. I think it's an awesome setup. I'm definitely going to do that in the future. Once I maybe get some breeding going with my own Julidochromis, I'll probably set up more of a community setup. Another great option would be the Synodontis petricola. That would work really well. And a lot of people will ask about Frontosa because they are large Lake Tanganyikan fish. And in some cases that could work, but you do need a very large tank to keep a group of Frontosa together and happy. Probably like a 180 around that size would be what you would need for just Frontosa. But if you're wanting to add more Lake Tanganyikans with them, like the Julidochromis, I would just recommend getting some larger size, more adult size Julidochromis. Of course, you run into risk of the Frontosa eating them, and they would definitely pick off a lot of the babies if there's breeding in the tank. They would probably go after things like shell dwellers, although I've seen it done. If you have a ton of rock work and a ton of shells, you could probably get away with Frontosa, but it's a lot trickier and a lot more of a risk long term. Another really good option for Lake Tanganyika cichlid is the Burchardi, which I forgot to mention. They are very rapid breeders, so just watch out for that, but you could definitely add them to a Julidochromis tank. And when it comes to adding them to non-Lake Tanganyikan setups, it's really hard to recommend anything because I don't think they go very well with Lake Malawi cichlids like Mbuna, peacocks, and haps. They're just too aggressive, fighting over territory, or boisterous when it comes to the peacocks and haps. I also think they might be too small or passive to go with your mid to large size American cichlids, so I don't know if I can recommend any of that. The South American dwarf cichlids, maybe they could work, although their water parameters are pretty different. Even though I say a lot of these cichlids are adaptable, especially if they're tank bred to different water parameters, it's just not ideal, and some people don't like the optics of mixing a Lake Tanganyikan fish with South Americans or Central Americans. So you have your tank size and your tank mates. What would the tank setup look like? Well, in my 40-gallon breeder, I think this is a good example. I definitely recommend sand and probably aragonite sand. Aragonite's great for buffering your pH, keeping it high so that your Lake Tanganyikans are happy and thriving in that environment. But I think the most important thing is having a lot of rock work and caves for the Julidochromis. That is their natural habitat, where they will show their best behavior and personality. They will go in and out of the nooks and crannies of the rocks, and the more rocks and caves that you have, the more territories they have, the more comfortable they will be in the tank, the more colored up they'll be, more likely to breed, and they come out of hiding way more if they know they have places to go back to if they need to. Another touch I like to add to my tank was just some shells to kind of mimic that biotope of Lake Tanganyika. It's not perfect, but it does look kind of cool, even if you don't have shell dwellers. I think it's a nice touch. And then Julidochromis will do absolutely fine with plants. They will not eat or destroy plants, which is a great thing. It's not really the Lake Tanganyikan biotope look because there's not much vegetation in the lake, but I do think something in the background, I'm going to add probably Vallisneria to my tank. I think it would be a really good look to have that behind all the rock work with the shells in the foreground. It's a really cool setup. You could even expand to something larger than a 40-gallon breeder, and I think it would be an awesome looking tank. And Julidochromis are omnivores and they are not picky eaters. I would just make sure you have a varied diet for them. So I go with extreme krill and extreme spirulina flakes. I also mix in the SoFly pellets, which they really like, just giving them a mix of proteins and veggie matter. And then when it comes to breeding, they are super easy to breed. Like I said, if you have the right pH and water parameters, that's going to make it super easy to do. And if you have enough rock work, they're going to feel comfortable. They're going to go in that rock work, and that's where they're going to lay their eggs. And it's going to be hard to see that. Probably it's going to be out of view. Then eventually you're going to have little babies poking out of the rocks, and it's a really interesting thing to see. Sometimes they will lay their eggs around the outsides or on top of rocks, but it's a little more rare than when they go actually in the rocks. Another cool fact is that Julidochromis species will pair up and basically be together for life. and they will lay eggs many times and probably have many rounds of babies if you have a good setup for them. And I think the best way of getting those pairs is just to get a small group. So what I did is I got 7 of them. They're still pretty small, but once they grow up, maybe a few months down the line, they'll start to get more yellow in their bodies, and they will potentially start pairing up, which would be a really cool thing to see. And lastly, where do you find Julidochromis species? Well, big box stores probably aren't going to be keeping them. You may have a good local fish store that has a good cichlid selection. Sometimes you might get lucky and you might find them there, but you could always find them online. Imperial Tropicals has a great selection, and you can use the code CichlidBros for 5% off your order. Dave's Rare Aquarium Fish is another awesome spot for all these different types of rare Lake Tanganyikan fish, so definitely check out one of those 2 spots if you're looking to order online. I would highly recommend both. But that does it for the care and breeding guide on the Julidochromis species. If you have any questions, definitely leave those down in the comment section, and thanks again for watching.